Let's switch for a minute and talk about sort of the context of one of the other pieces that you're reporting from the Central African Republic and France's secret war, and the sense that France had been for many years since nominally leaving the Central African Republic, was still manipulating it as a colony. That's the central allegation in your reporting, having been down there. But having reported what you saw down there, you wove into that a huge number of insights into French contemporary history and the political history of French neo-colonialism for an audience that doesn't read French, so is not probably has had very, very little exposure to what's going on in the Central African Republic.
It's fascinating that most educated liberal people would be aware of the American kind of neo-colonial, United States of America's neo-colonial relationship to Latin America, the overthrow of Salvador Allende, the support for the Contras, all that. Most kind of educated liberals would be aware of that, and rightly, and it's absolutely seen. And I've been to Venezuela and reported on the attempted coup on Chavez, and it's repulsive. Very few people are aware of the really strikingly similar relationship that France has had to Central Africa. Central African Republic obviously being the most extreme example, but the fact, for example, that the Rwandan genocide simply could not have happened in the way it happened, to the degree it happened, without active French support for the Hutu genocidaires. And this is virtually an unknown story in Britain. I mean, there's been some discussion about it in France. We've got trials going on now in France of some of the people who were responsible. But there was a phrase coined by de Gaulle when he withdrew, which was when he oversaw some of the withdrawals from French colonies. He called it France Afrique, meaning French Africa. But of course, there's a pun in that he wasn't aware of. France Afrique, France for cash, which has been much more what it's been like. What you've seen is the French withdrew their actual colonial power, and then re-established neo-colonial power. So no one rules Central African Republic without the approval of France, and you see that anywhere you go. I mean, I should explain the way that I got into this story. Was that there was something very small news and brief story I saw in the New York Times, which I thought was bizarre. There was a little news in brief saying that must have been the spring of 2007, saying France was bombing the Central African Republic, and I thought this is, and I looked around and there was nothing in the English press, there was very little in the French press about that. This is very odd. What's happening? And I couldn't find anything. And I spoke to some of the human rights organisations, and they said something odd's going on, but we don't know what. We can't get out there because they were bombing the far north of the Central African. I mean, the Central African Republic is massive, and the least densely populated country in the world. There's only about 3.8 million people there. So I thought, right, well, I'll go. So I went to the far north where they were bombing a city called Birao, which you can only get to by, it's almost completely cut off. But you can only get there by there's one flight that the UN does that carries 8 people every week. And then you have to drive for ages. But and of course the NGOs and the UN people have preference, and you have to wait for ages. But when I got there, it was utterly bizarre. This town, this city, which had been permanently inhabited for 200 years, was virtually empty. Only 10% of the population was there, and you'd had the French had just been bombing the shit out of it, and you thought this is very odd. What's going on here? And speaking to people, the French-backed militia, the French-trained militia, accountable to Jean-François Bozizé, who was the French installed president, France installed president, had been going around killing people, and it was all very odd and very disorienting. You think, well, what is going on? Why are the French in Central Africa? What are they doing? And most people would be aware that with South America, it's tied to resources, corporations. Most famous example being Guatemala, and the United Fruit Company pleading with Eisenhower to overthrow the Guatemalan government because they were interfering with their corporate behaviour. There's some similarity in the Central African Republic. Partly it's to do with the projection of power and maintaining a stake in Central Africa's resources. So, for example, the French are heavily dependent on nuclear power. 60% of their domestic electricity comes from nuclear power. And there's actually, I didn't know this, but there's actually surprisingly little uranium in the world. And a lot of it is in Central African Republic. And they need that literally to keep the lights on. So part of it's that. Part of it's that they use the Central African votes as a kind of bolster at the UN. And this was one of the and also partly they think that if they don't do it, the Chinese will get it, and the Americans will get it, and so on. And this is partly what drove the supporting for the Rwandan genocide, because it seems, why would a liberal democratic state in the middle of Western Europe in the early 20th century support a genocide in Africa? It seems incomprehensible to us. Mitterrand, who was dying and really quite deranged by the end of his life, became convinced that the Tutsis who were rising up in Rwanda were American stooges, were being backed by the CIA. We now know there really isn't any evidence for that. He became convinced they were, and he became convinced that they were trying to turn Rwanda from a kind of francophone country to an Americaphone country, if there could be such a thing, Americaphile country. And he was convinced that the Tutsis were American stooges, that Kagame was an American stooge, and so he backed the Hutu power people, and he really backed them. I mean, those cards that divided the Rwandan population into Hutus and Tutsis to prepare them for execution, they were printed in Paris. He armed and equipped the Hutus. He carried on giving them arms. After the genocide had begun, he carried on giving them arms. Even, I think one of the most repulsive, you look at Operation Turquoise, which was this is so repulsive, that when there was finally a huge fuss about the genocide after we were about 50 days in, 400,000 Tutsis had been butchered, the French finally said, oh, okay, we probably shouldn't be arming the Hutus, we'll sort this out now. And of course, because the French are there and they've got troops there, that the world basically acquiesced in that. So they send in what they called a peacekeeping operation, Operation Turquoise, where they send in French troops. And I met some of the French troops in the Central African Republic who'd been involved in this, who were really traumatised by what they'd done. What they did is they went to the places where the massacres had been happening. They got the hiding Tutsis. They called to them and they said, you can come out now, we're the international community, we're here from the UN, we're here with the permission of the UN, you can come out now. So they came out, they said, okay, wait here, we'll come back in 3 days. Then left them with the Hutus, who then finished off the genocide and massacred even more of them. It's this astonishing story, and Francois Mitterrand, I think, is one of those figures who's really got away in history very lightly. This is a man who began his career supporting one genocide, the Vichy genocide, the Nazi genocide, and ended it supporting another. He's a really repulsive figure. One of his security guards later said that when he was challenged about this, Mitterrand said, oh, no one in France cares about a genocide of a bunch of black people. So anyway, Mitterrand was convinced that that was the only way to retain French influence in Central Africa. And
now was this a story that you did on that, for that piece and then stopped? Have you been back to that story?
I haven't been back. I've been following it. The other Central African horror that I follow closely, because I've been there, is the war in the Congo, which is obviously in the DRC, which has started again now, which is another separate scandal where France has been shameful, but unfortunately equally disgusting has been America and the whole of the EU. We've really raped that country. The UN panel of experts described it as described what's happened in Congo as armies of business pillaging the country on our behalf, which is true. And it's the deadliest war since Adolf Hitler marched across Europe. We've got more than 5 million dead people now, and the conflict's always been going on, but really flaring up again violently in the east. So, yeah, I try to follow those things as closely. I mean, my understanding of what's happening in Central African Republic is that the reason why the French went into the Central African Republic when I was there was because there was an uprising against Bouzize, who's their puppet president, and the uprising's been crushed. So all those people who led the uprising, because for perfectly good reasons, because they were pissed off that they don't have any schools and hospitals and they're cut off and there's no roads. Not exactly difficult things to be angry about. They're all out in the bush somewhere, hiding.